Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on the last night on the Titanic. We looked at the baker in the last episode. In this episode, we're going to be looking at someone different, the popcorn vendor, one person in particular, and that is Popcorn Dan. So Veronica, tell us about Popcorn Dan and how he is one of America's first food truck operators.
When I was a little girl, I was just enamored with a story about a man who lived very near my hometown, which is Wausau, Wisconsin, and he lived in Merrill, several miles away, but in the same vicinity. And people would tell me that he was on the Titanic. Now, when I was a little girl and heard that, I thought, wow, that's amazing. How did a man from this area, which at the time was much more secluded than it is now from the metropolitan world, how did he get on the Titanic? My 7th grade teacher, Mrs. Reichenberger at the time, she read every class, got a treat. She would read the book A Night to Remember to each class every year. And she went into explanations about things. She would stop and explain at certain points throughout the book. And one of the things I'll never forget her telling our class was that she got to the point where she was just describing the enormity of this ship, how big it was. And she said it was from where we were sitting at that moment at Horseman Middle School in Wausau, all the way down to where the library still stands today. The middle school is gone. The library is still there. And this would have been 6 or 7 city blocks long. And right away, I had this vision in my mind of this huge, imposing, foreboding ship and how it must have looked at that size. And I thought, how did Dan Coxon, the man that I heard about who came from this community, how did he end up on the Titanic? So I always wanted to learn more about this man. They called him Popcorn Dan because he sold popcorn from a red and white colored Crater popcorn wagon, which also supplied peanuts, and he could roast them on the popcorn cart, and he sold those as well.
What was it like for him on the Titanic? He has a truck that he's selling out of when he's going about city blocks, but on the Titanic itself, I assume that he's in a fixed place, or is he moving around the ship? What does it look like?
He and his brother and nephew, his brother Alfred and his nephew Jan Natus, went with him to Southampton to board the Titanic on the day that Dan boarded. He had gone to England to visit them because he was from London. So he had gone to London to visit his family. He was in his 50s. He had moved from England to first Canada, then to Merrill, Wisconsin years earlier. And this was his trip home. He would make it every couple years or so. And so like so many of us, when we move away from home and we go back to visit family, we're really excited about seeing them. And this was a very special trip for him. And he wrote a letter telling people that he was going back on the Titanic. He was so excited. And Alfred and Jan went with him, and they spent an hour and a half on the great ship looking through every nook and cranny that they could get on board and see. Well, Dan was in 3rd class. He was in steerage, which, wasn't as opulent as we think of when we think of Titanic. That opulence was not there, obviously, but it was still nicer than accommodations aboard other ships at the time. One of the things that Dan experienced when he was boarding the Titanic was that his brother told the British inquiry officials later that he noticed that Dan experienced a bit more scrutiny than other passengers as he boarded because of his left arm Dan had a shriveled arm that he was really challenged by. And so they really gave him a second and third look, asking for papers and so forth. And then once he was on, Dan's experience aboard the Titanic would have been very similar to what we see in television and in the movies. We've seen menus from steerage, so we know that things like gruel and porridge and oat cakes and buckwheat cakes, those were the standard fare that they ate on a daily basis. And very similar to the lifestyle that we saw in the movie Titanic by James Cameron.
One follow-up question with Dan, when inspectors were suspicious of him because of his arm, what did they think? Did they think that this was a miscreant, this was a stowaway, somebody who was poor who was trying to get on? Why did that his physical problem give him so much suspicion?
That's an interesting question, and it may be, relevant to how we all look at, just naturally tend to look at people that don't look like we do, whether it's something that is a physical malfunction that they, have no control over, something like that, to the color of someone's skin. I think there's just, probably a propensity towards that in our basic human nature. But that's basically what it was. It was, very just much higher scrutiny, because I think people tend to see someone that doesn't look like them and they really question it harder. But that's just my own personal opinion. I don't want to insert that because we don't know that for sure.
Well, his life is interesting before he gets on the Titanic, and I want to look at a few things about his background. If I understand correctly, you have a list of items he owned, and some of them really don't line up from what we would think of as a popcorn seller owning. So what were some of those interesting things that he owns?
Well, one of the most amazing things is a fur coat that Dan went out to buy 2 days before Thanksgiving in 1911. He went out on the dirt roads of Merrill, Wisconsin. The roads were dirt at that time, and it was very cold that day. And he went out to shop for his trip. He was going to be leaving in December to go see his family. And like you and I and other people do when we're going to go see our family, we want to look our best, and we go and buy new clothes. And he was doing that. He paid $115 for a fur coat, which would have been the equivalent of today, it would be about $3,000. So that really says a lot about style in those days, travel style. Here is a popcorn vendor, and he also did odd jobs like hauling things for people and painting and patching jobs and just real odd jobs. And yet he prioritized his money so that he could spend a lot to look good. Even in steerage, I mean, even there, steerage passengers were, very conscious of how they looked, of course. And another point about Dan that I should point out on that note is one of his relatives, a great nephew of his, has pointed out to me that Dan could have afforded to travel in a different class. But for whatever reason, he was traveling in steerage. He must have been very good with his money. He had a phonograph that was a newfangled invention at the time. It was worth today it would have been worth about $160. But what's really an insight into this man is that he owned 2 houses. One was worth $1,000 and the other was worth $400. He lived in the one that was worth $400 and rented the other one out. And we all know people who do that today, where they're very thrifty, and they're renting out a much more fabulous home and living in the lesser one. And that's what Dan did.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm no popcorn expert, nor have I ever met one before, but I wonder if it was more of a wealthy novelty instead of, if I think of someone selling popcorn today, I imagine a teenager working a summer job at a baseball stadium or at a county fair. But maybe it was a novelty for the more well-to-do back then. Yeah, so that's pretty like he's doing well for himself. And among the houses he owned, If I understand correctly, wasn't one of them haunted, or people thought it was haunted?
Well, it wasn't one of the houses he owned for a while, probably while he was saving to purchase his houses. He was a caretaker. He lived in a house, a beautiful, majestic Queen Anne house on the banks of the Wisconsin River. And he was a live-in caretaker there. And the house is purportedly haunted. There's a whole series of stories of things that had happened to people that lived in that house. And the house comes up in conversation when we talk locally about Popcorn Dan, because the idea being, one of the people that lived there was on the Titanic.
Yeah, I wonder, with all these stories coming out, did you ever get a sense looking into his life that many of these things came out after he died? It's hard not to ascribe all these mystical or almost supernatural things happening before the Titanic, these ominous warnings of something terrible. Was it all a coincidence, or did you get a sense that people were making this mystical legacy about him after the fact?
It does seem to fit in with the whole legacy, in my mind, the whole legacy of that house, the stories that are told about people that have lived there. Additionally, as you mentioned, and throughout the book, there are examples of people who insisted that they had premonitions not to get on the Titanic.
And it'd be hard to not in this era when I think spiritualism is really big and seances and other stuff that goes in the 1920s and 30s, that with one of the biggest disasters that ever happens, people probably couldn't help but just, describe, oh, I had this vision, I had this prophetic experience telling me something like that would happen.
Right, exactly.
So let's get to when he gets on the ship. You mentioned that he was in third class, and from what you were able to research, do you know much of what happens to him after the Titanic strikes the iceberg and everything else?
I do not know, and I wish I did know. For a time, I had looked very carefully because I marveled at this man my whole childhood and wanted to know everything I could about him. And years ago, at the centennial year in 2012, which was it marked the 100 years since the sinking, I was doing quite a bit of research. Then I came across a New York Times article from 1912 that had a list of people that the McKay Bennett had found in the ocean, the bodies of people that they had recovered. And one of those, it said Dan Coxon's name, and it also said it might be Denton Cox, who was a crew member, but was not on the crew list. So for years, people that share my love of Dan's story, we'd hoped that there was a chance that maybe he had been out of steerage, past the blockades that people were held back by, and was able to get onto the deck to fight for his life and was in the water. However, in recent years, it was confirmed that that body that the McKay Bennett found was not Dan Coxon's. It was the body of Denton Cox, the crew member that was apparently not on the crew manifest. But one interesting note that we have found related to Dan is that several years ago, a man from my hometown was watching a show on TV. I think it was National Geographic. And he's very careful about what he notices. This man actually was able to see a picture on the TV, and it showed some money, dollar bills and coins. And he looked up really close. He stopped. He recorded the show so he could stop and look at it. And by golly, it said Merrill, Wisconsin on the dollar bills. And yes, and at that time, because I had to run this to ground, and I found out that those dollar bills had been printed in Merrill back then. They weren't just printed at the mint. Those were Dan's, because they had to have been, because this is such a remote area at that time. It's much different now. It's very connected, like all communities are, because in part due to the internet and so forth. But at that time, there would have been no other person that would have been carrying currency like that around. So we do have that remnant of Dan's experience aboard. We know what was in his wallet.